I used to believe that love could conquer anything. That family meant everything. That blood was thicker than water. I was wrong about all of it. Dead wrong. And by the time I realized just how naive I'd been, I was standing in the ruins of everything I'd spent 43 years building, watching my own daughter, my flesh and blood, drive away in a car I'd paid for, wearing jewelry I'd bought her, living in a house that should have been mine, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it all began to unravel. The wedding. Oh, that beautiful, perfect, absolutely flawless wedding that cost me $168,000. Every detail was pristine. The flowers were imported from Ecuador, white orchids and peonies that cost more per stem than most people spend on groceries in a week. The venue was the Grandview Estate, with its marble columns and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where senators' daughters get married. The dress, God, that dress, was a custom Vera Wang creation that took 8 months to make and cost more than some people's cars. Everything looked perfect from the outside. My daughter Sarah looked radiant walking down that aisle, her veil trailing 6 feet behind her like something out of a fairy tale. Her new husband Michael seemed genuinely smitten, and why wouldn't he be? She was stunning that day, glowing with the kind of happiness that money can't buy. At least that's what I thought at the time. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. I remember standing there in my navy Armani suit, the one I'd bought specifically for this occasion, watching my only child promise to love, honor, and cherish this man I barely knew. Michael came from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for so many generations they'd forgotten what it felt like to worry about anything. His parents looked at me with that particular brand of polite disdain reserved for new money, for people who'd had to work for everything they owned, and I had worked for everything. I'd clawed my way up from nothing, from a 2-bedroom apartment above my mother's laundromat to a mansion in Beacon Hill with 7 bedrooms and a view of the harbor. I'd built a construction company from the ground up, starting with nothing but a used truck and a willingness to work 18-hour days. For 25 years, I'd poured everything I had into that business, into building something I could pass down to my daughter. The early years of my marriage to Sarah's father had been a masterclass in survival. David was charming when he wanted to be, but he had a temper that could turn a room cold in seconds. He'd married me when I was 22 and pregnant, desperate and grateful for the stability he offered. But stability came with a price. He expected dinner on the table at 6 sharp every night. He expected his shirts pressed and his shoes polished. He expected me to smile and nod when his business partners made jokes about women belonging in the kitchen. I learned to bite my tongue until it bled. I learned to swallow my opinions and my dreams and my sense of self until there was almost nothing left of who I used to be. The only thing that kept me going was Sarah, my beautiful, brilliant daughter who was going to have everything I never did. She was going to go to the best schools, wear the finest clothes, marry someone worthy of her. She was going to be everything I couldn't be. When David died of a heart attack at 58, I inherited everything. The construction company, the house, the investments, the life insurance, all of it. For the first time in my adult life, I was free to make my own decisions. And every decision I made was for Sarah. I sent her to Swiss boarding schools and Ivy League universities. I bought her apartments in Manhattan and Paris. I funded her art gallery, her yoga studio, her brief and expensive foray into organic farming. Whatever she wanted, I gave her. I thought I was buying her love, her loyalty, her future. I thought I was securing my legacy. The wedding should have been the culmination of everything I'd worked for. My daughter, radiant and happy, marrying into a family that would elevate our social standing even further. But even as I smiled and raised champagne toasts that night, there was something nagging at me. Something in the way Michael's parents barely acknowledged my presence during the reception. Something in the way the conversation stopped when I approached certain groups of guests. I'd spent so much money on that wedding that I had to take out a loan against one of my properties. It was supposed to be an investment in Sarah's future, in our family's reputation. I told myself it was worth it when I saw the society page photos, when I heard people talking about what an elegant affair it had been. But the bills kept coming long after the flowers had wilted and the cake had been eaten. The first sign of real trouble came 3 months after the wedding. I was reviewing the quarterly reports from my construction company when I noticed some irregularities. Payments that should have been made to suppliers hadn't been processed. Project budgets were showing deficits that didn't make sense. When I called my accountant, he seemed evasive, uncomfortable. He suggested we meet in person to discuss the numbers. That meeting changed everything. Sitting in his sterile office with its beige walls and motivational posters, listening to him explain how systematically my accounts had been drained, I felt something inside me die. $2.7 million. Gone. Transferred to accounts I'd never authorized, for expenses I'd never approved. The trail led directly to Sarah. My daughter, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, had been stealing from me for over 2 years. She'd used her power of attorney, which I'd given her to help manage some of my smaller investments, to systematically drain my accounts. She'd bought properties in other states, invested in ventures I'd never heard of, even taken out credit lines using my assets as collateral. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. We met at her brownstone, the one I'd bought her as a wedding gift, and she served tea in china cups that cost more than most people make in a week. She was calm, almost serene, as she explained that she'd only taken what she considered her inheritance anyway. She said she was tired of asking for money, tired of justifying every purchase to me. She said she was an adult and deserved to control her own financial destiny. "It's not like you were going to live forever, Mother," she said, stirring sugar into her tea with a tiny silver spoon. I just accelerated the timeline a bit. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This was the child I'd devoted my entire life to, the person I'd thought loved me despite all my flaws and mistakes. But as I looked at her sitting there in her silk blouse and designer jewelry, all paid for with my money, I realized I was looking at a stranger. A beautiful, cold, calculating stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her own ambitions. I left that house in a daze, barely able to drive home. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls with lawyers and accountants, each conversation revealing new depths to Sarah's betrayal. She hadn't just taken money, she'd maneuvered me into debt. She'd used my credit to finance investments that benefited only her. She'd even convinced me to co-sign loans that I was now solely responsible for paying back. Within 6 months, I lost everything. The house in Beacon Hill went to pay off the loans Sarah had taken out in my name. The construction company had to be sold to cover the debts she'd accumulated. My retirement accounts were liquidated to pay penalties and fees from her unauthorized transactions. At 65 years old, I found myself moving into a 1-bedroom apartment in a part of town I would never have imagined living in, surviving on Social Security and what little remained of my savings. But Sarah wasn't done with me yet. When I tried to challenge some of the transactions legally, she hired the most expensive law firm in the city to defend herself. She painted me as a bitter old woman suffering from early dementia, someone who couldn't be trusted to manage her own affairs. She had documentation showing that I'd signed dozens of financial documents, even though I couldn't remember half of them. She had witnesses, my own financial advisors, testifying that I'd seemed confused and forgetful in recent meetings. The worst part was that some of it was true. The stress of discovering her betrayal had affected my memory, my ability to focus. I would sit in court listening to my own daughter's lawyers describe me as mentally incompetent, and sometimes I wondered if they were right. How else could I have been so blind to what was happening right under my nose? Tell me in the comments below where you're watching this from. What city? What country? I want to know how far this story is reaching, because what happened next needs to be heard everywhere. The trial lasted 4 months. Every day, I sat in the gallery watching my daughter's life dissected in excruciating detail. Her affair, her financial crimes, her systematic betrayal of everyone who had trusted her, all of it laid out for the world to see. Michael had divorced her by then and was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for immunity from his own family's tax problems. Her art gallery had closed permanently, its reputation destroyed by the forgery scandal. Her expensive brownstone had been seized as part of the criminal asset forfeiture. When the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on 7 counts, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but a cold satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Sarah was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all the victims of the investment scheme, including me. But even as I watched her being led away in shackles, I realized that my victory was hollow. I had destroyed my daughter's life, but I hadn't gotten my own life back. The money was gone forever, scattered through so many different accounts and investments that it would never be recovered. The construction company I'd spent decades building was now owned by strangers. The house where I'd raised Sarah, where I'd dreamed of spending my retirement, belonged to someone else. Most importantly, I had lost my daughter. Not just to prison, but to the cold, calculating person I had become in my quest for revenge. The woman who could orchestrate such an elaborate and devastating campaign of retribution was not someone I recognized. She certainly wasn't someone who deserved to be loved by anyone, least of all by the child she had systematically destroyed. I live now in that same one-bedroom apartment, surviving on Social Security and the small pension I receive from selling the construction company. I have no friends. I burned those bridges during my campaign against Sarah, using people's secrets and weaknesses as weapons in my war. I have no family. My daughter is in prison and won't speak to me, even though I write to her every month. I have no purpose except to wait for each day to end and the next one to begin. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had handled things differently. If I had tried to understand why Sarah felt she needed to steal from me, instead of simply asking for what she wanted. If I had sought therapy instead of revenge. If I had chosen forgiveness over justice. But those thoughts are just another form of torture, because I know I can never go back and make different choices. The truth is that I became exactly what Sarah accused me of being, a bitter old woman who valued money more than love, control more than family, winning more than everything else that makes life worth living. I got my revenge, but it cost me everything that mattered. I won the war, but destroyed everything I was fighting for in the process. Sarah will be released from prison in 6 more years. She'll be 42 years old, still young enough to start over, to build a new life with people who don't know about her mistakes. But I'll be 77 by then, an old woman with nothing to offer except apologies that can never undo the damage I've caused. I tell myself that I had no choice, that she forced me to fight back, that everything I did was justified by what she did to me first. But late at night, when I'm alone in this small apartment listening to sirens and traffic and the sounds of other people living their lives, I know the truth. I chose revenge over redemption. I chose destruction over healing. I chose to become a monster in order to defeat one. And now all I have left are these memories, these stories, these cautionary tales about what happens when love turns to hate and family becomes the enemy. I share them not because I'm proud of what I've done, but because I hope someone else might learn from my mistakes, might choose differently when faced with betrayal and loss and the terrible temptation of revenge. The wedding looked flawless from the outside. But it was the beginning of the end for all of us, the moment when everything I thought I knew about love and family and the price of getting what you want started to crumble. And by the time the last dance was over and the last guest had gone home, the seeds of our mutual destruction had already been planted. If this story affected you, if it made you think about your own family relationships or the price of revenge, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. These stories need to be told, even when they don't have happy endings. Especially when they don't have happy endings. The legal proceedings dragged on for 18 months. 18 months of court dates and depositions and lawyer fees that ate through what little money I had left. Sarah seemed to enjoy it. She would arrive at hearings perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, speaking to her legal team in low, confident tones while I sat across the room in clothes I'd bought from discount stores, taking notes on a yellow legal pad because I couldn't afford to hire a court reporter. But I wasn't as broken as everyone thought. During those long, humiliating months, something was changing inside me. The grief and shock were hardening into something else. Something colder and more focused. If Sarah wanted a war, I was going to give her one. But I was going to fight it on my terms, using weapons she didn't know I possessed. You see, when you build a construction company from nothing, you learn things about people. You learn about their weaknesses, their secrets, their pressure points. You develop relationships with people who exist in the gray areas of business and law. People who know how to find information that others want to keep hidden. People who understand that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you create for yourself. I started with Michael's family. Old money families like theirs don't stay wealthy for generations by being completely honest about everything. They have trusts and shell companies and offshore accounts, financial structures designed to minimize taxes and maximize privacy. Most of it is perfectly legal, but some of it occupies that murky space between legal and ethical. And sometimes, if you know where to look, you can find things that cross the line entirely. It took me 6 months and most of my remaining savings, but I found what I was looking for. Michael's father had been using family trusts to hide income from real estate deals that should have been reported to the IRS. Nothing huge by their standards, maybe $500,000 in avoided taxes over several years, but enough to create serious problems if it came to light. More importantly, I discovered that Sarah was now listed as a beneficiary on several of these trusts, which meant she was legally complicit in the tax evasion scheme. I also found something else. Something that would have been devastating to Sarah's marriage if it had been revealed at the wrong time. She'd been having an affair with her art dealer, a smooth-talking man named Philippe, who specialized in selling overpriced paintings to wealthy women with more money than art knowledge. The affair had started before her wedding and had continued through the early months of her marriage. I had photos, hotel receipts, even recordings of some of their phone conversations, but I didn't use any of this information right away. I was learning patience, the kind of cold, calculating patience that comes from having nothing left to lose. Instead, I hired a new lawyer, someone with a reputation for taking cases that other attorneys wouldn't touch. Someone who understood that sometimes the law is less important than leverage. The first phase of my counterattack was subtle. I filed complaints with the IRS about the Michael family's tax irregularities, providing just enough information to trigger an audit without revealing how I'd obtained it. Tax audits are slow, thorough, and extremely stressful, especially for families who value their privacy above all else. Within weeks, Michael's parents were dealing with federal investigators asking uncomfortable questions about their financial arrangements. The second phase involved Sarah's art gallery. It turned out that several of the paintings she'd purchased with my stolen money were forgeries, sold to her by the same Philippe who was sharing her bed. The gallery was already operating at a loss. It had never been a serious business. Just an expensive hobby funded by my hard work, but the forgery scandal would destroy what little reputation it had. Arranged for the information about the fake paintings, to reach an art authentication expert who had a reputation for exposing fraud in high-end galleries. He was thorough and relentless, exactly the kind of person who would pursue a story like this to its conclusion, regardless of who got hurt in the process. Within days, there were articles in art magazines questioning the authenticity of several pieces in Sarah's collection. Phase 3 was more personal. I sent copies of the photos and evidence of Sarah's affair to Michael's mother, along with a carefully worded letter expressing my concern about my daughter's behavior and my hope that the family could find a way to address these issues privately. I knew that a woman who had spent her entire life maintaining her family's reputation would not take kindly to being associated with a scandal like this. The effects were swift and devastating. Michael's parents confronted him about Sarah's affair, about the tax problems, about the questions surrounding her art gallery. They gave him an ultimatum: divorce Sarah and distance himself from her financial problems, or be cut off from the family fortune entirely. Michael, who had never worked a day in his life and had no idea how to support himself without his parents' money, chose his inheritance over his wife. But I still wasn't done. The final phase of my plan was the most complex and the most satisfying. I had spent months documenting every transaction Sarah had made with my stolen money, creating a paper trail that showed exactly how she'd moved funds from my accounts to her own investments. I'd also discovered that some of these investments were actually elaborate money laundering schemes designed to hide the profits from various illegal activities. Sarah thought she was smart, but she'd been manipulated by people who were much smarter than both of us. The investment advisors she'd trusted with my money had used it to fund everything from illegal gambling operations to tax evasion schemes. She wasn't just guilty of stealing from me. She was an unwitting participant in a criminal enterprise that involved millions of dollars and dozens of other victims. I turned all of this information over to federal prosecutors, along with my own testimony about how my daughter had systematically stolen from me and hidden the money in these fraudulent investment schemes. The case took 2 years to come to trial, but when it did, Sarah found herself facing not just civil lawsuits from me and other victims, but federal criminal charges for money laundering and conspiracy to commit fraud. The woman who had once sat in her designer kitchen, telling me that she'd only taken what was rightfully hers, was now sitting in a federal courthouse, wearing an orange jumpsuit, listening to prosecutors describe her as a key figure in a sophisticated criminal operation. Her expensive lawyers, the ones she'd hired to prove I was incompetent, were now arguing that she was too naive and trusting to have known what she was really involved in.